What happens when a talk show host's sharp tongue cuts too deep, and a Hollywood legend refuses to take the hit? On a chilly evening in Los Angeles, the stage of Jimmy Kimmel Live buzzed with the usual electric anticipation. The audience clapped as the cameras rolled, but the air grew heavy when Robert De Niro, the man whose name carried decades of cinematic weight, stepped onto the set. His eyes, sharp as ever, locked onto Jimmy Kimmel, who leaned back in his chair, with a smirk that spelled trouble. Kimmel, known for his biting humor, had invited De Niro to discuss his latest project, a small indie film called Shadows of Valor, a gritty drama that had critics raving, but box offices yawning. The crowd expected a friendly chat. They got a war instead. Kimmel started innocently enough, asking De Niro about the film's quiet release. But his tone shifted, dripping with mockery. "So, Robert, let's be real. Shadows of Valor? More. Like shadows of a career flop, right?" The audience gasped, then laughed nervously, unsure if this was part of the bit. De Niro's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. Kimmel didn't stop. "I mean, come on, you're the guy from Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, and now you're slumming it in some artsy flick nobody saw? What's next? Community theater?" The crowd's laughter grew louder, egged on by Kimmel's smug grin, but De Niro's face was stone, his eyes burning with a fury that silenced the room when he finally spoke. "You think you're clever, Jimmy?" De Niro's voice was low, deliberate, each word a blade. "You sit there, hiding behind your desk, throwing cheap shots like some kid who never grew up. You don't know a damn thing about the work I put into that film." The audience froze, sensing the shift. Kimmel, unfazed, leaned forward, his smirk widening. "Oh, come on, Robert, it's just a joke. Lighten up. Or is that film so bad you can't take a little ribbing?" The crowd tittered, but De Niro wasn't playing. He leaned closer, his voice rising. "You call that a joke? You're not funny, Jimmy. You're just mean. You think you can drag my name through the mud for a few laughs? I've been in this game longer than you've been breathing." The tension crackled like static. Kimmel, sensing the crowd's unease, tried to pivot. All right, let's talk about something else. Your charity work, maybe?" But De Niro wasn't having it. He stood, towering over the desk, his presence commanding the room. "No, we're not moving on. You don't get to insult me, my choices, my work, and then skip to the next segment like nothing happened. You want to talk about my career? Let's talk about yours. How's it feel to make a living tearing people down?" The audience gasped, some clapping, others whispering. Kimmel's face flushed, his easy confidence cracking. He opened his mouth to retort, but De Niro cut him off. "You owe me an apology. Jimmy, right here, right now." The stage manager signaled for a commercial break, but De Niro didn't budge, his eyes locked on Kimmel, who squirmed under the weight of the moment. The crowd was riveted, phones already out, capturing every second of the showdown. Kimmel, cornered, tried to laugh it off. "An apology? For what? Telling the truth? Your movie tanked, Robert. That's not on me." De Niro's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't about the movie. It's about respect. You crossed a line, and I'm not leaving this stage until you own it." The audience roared, some cheering for De Niro, others stunned by the raw intensity. The cameras kept rolling, the crew too shocked to cut away. Kimmel, his charm fading, realized he'd underestimated the man in front of him. The break loomed, but the fight was far from over. As the commercial break ended, the studio lights flared, back to life, casting harsh shadows across the set of Jimmy Kimmel Live. The audience, still buzzing from the earlier clash, leaned forward in their seats, eyes darting between Robert De Niro, who stood rigid with barely contained fury, and Jimmy Kimmel, whose smirk had morphed into a defiant scowl. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every twitch of emotion, every bead of sweat. The atmosphere was a powder keg, and Kimmel, instead of dousing the flames, seemed determined to light another match. He leaned back, crossing his arms, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "So, Robert, you want an apology? For what exactly?" "Hurting." "Your feelings? This is show business, not a therapy session." The crowd murmured, some laughing, others hissing, sensing the host's refusal to back down was about to cost him. De Niro's eyes narrowed, his voice a low growl that cut through the noise. "You think this is about my feelings? You're not that important, Jimmy. This is about you sitting there, acting like you're above everyone, mocking people's work to prop up your little circus." He gestured to the set, the bright lights, the applauding crowd. "You don't respect the craft. You don't respect the risk it takes to make something real, something that matters. You just tear it down because it's easy." The audience erupted, some cheering De Niro's raw honesty, others stunned by his intensity. Kimmel's face tightened, his knuckles whitening as he gripped his desk. He wasn't used to being challenged, not like this, not on his own turf. Kimmel shot back, his voice sharp and venomous. "Risk? You call that indie flop a risk? It was a paycheck, Robert, and a bad one. Don't lecture me about craft when you're out there chasing Oscar bait that nobody watches." The crowd gasped, the insult landing like a slap. De Niro took a step closer, his presence looming over Kimmel's desk. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, each word deliberate, heavy with years of experience. "I took that role because it meant something, because it told a story worth telling. You wouldn't understand that. You're too busy playing court jester for ratings." The audience roared, split between those rooting for De Niro's fire and those feeding off the chaos. Kimmel, his ego bruised, leaned forward, his voice rising to match De Niro's. "Court jester? At least I'm not pretending to be some deep artist while my movies bomb. You're not untouchable, Robert. You're just old news trying to stay relevant." The words hung in the air, cruel and cutting. The crowd went silent, the tension so thick it was suffocating. De Niro's face hardened, but his voice stayed calm, almost chilling. "Old news? I've built a career you couldn't dream of, and I did it without stepping on people to get there. You want to talk relevance? Look at this audience. They're not here for you. They're here for me." The crowd exploded, clapping and shouting, some standing in support of De Niro's defiance. Kimmel's composure cracked, his eyes flashing with anger. He stood, matching De Niro's height, though his presence felt smaller. "You think you're some kind of legend? You're a guest on my show, Robert. My show. You don't get to come in here and demand apologies like you own the place." De Niro didn't flinch. He stepped closer, their faces inches apart, the air between them electric. "Your show? Without people like me, you'd have nothing to talk about. You need us, Jimmy, but you're too arrogant to see it. Say you're sorry, or this gets worse." The audience held its breath, the crew frozen, unsure whether to cut to another break. Kimmel's jaw clenched, his pride warring, with the growing realization that he was losing control. The standoff was a ticking bomb, and neither man was backing down. The air in the studio crackled with raw hostility as Robert De Niro and Jimmy Kimmel stood face to face, the desk between them no longer a barrier but a battle line. The audience, caught in the grip of the escalating war, shifted restlessly, their earlier laughter replaced by a tense anticipation. Kimmel, his face flushed with a mix of anger and desperation, sensed the crowd slipping away. He was the host, the one who controlled the narrative, and yet De Niro's commanding presence had turned the tables. Determined to claw back his authority, Kimmel raised his hands, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow. "All right, Robert, you've made your point. You're the big, serious actor. But this is my stage, and I'm not groveling for anybody." His voice carried a sharp edge, a challenge meant to rally the crowd back to his side. De Niro's eyes didn't waver, his stance unyielding. "Your stage?" he said, his voice steady but laced with contempt. You think this is about stages? This is about you thinking you can humiliate people for a quick laugh. You mocked my work, Jimmy. Work I poured my soul into. You don't get to brush that off with a smirk, the audience murmured, some nodding, their loyalty shifting as Nero's words hit home. He wasn't just defending himself. He was speaking for every artist who'd ever been dismissed, every person who'd faced a cheap shot from someone hiding behind a microphone. The room felt smaller, the lights hotter, as the weight of his words settled over everyone. Kimmel, sensing the tide turning, doubled down, his voice rising with a reckless edge. Poured your soul? Give me a break, Robert. That movie was a snooze, and you know it. You're not some tortured artist. You're just mad I called it like I saw it. He turned to the audience, arms outstretched, fishing for support. Come on, folks, am I wrong? Nobody saw that film. A few scattered claps answered, but most of the crowd stayed silent, their eyes on De Niro, who stood like a statue, unshaken. Kimmel's grin faltered, his confidence crumbling under the weight of the room's disapproval. He'd miscalculated, and De Niro was ready to strike. You want to know why I did that film? De Niro's voice was quieter now, but it carried a raw power that silenced the room. It wasn't about money or fame. It was about telling a story that mattered to me, about a man who fought for something bigger than himself. I've spent my life telling stories like that, stories that stay with people. You wouldn't understand, Jimmy, because you don't create anything. You just tear it apart. The audience erupted in applause, some standing, their cheers drowning out Kimmel's attempt to interrupt. De Niro stepped closer, his voice rising with passion. I've worked with directors, writers, actors who put everything on the line. And you? You sit here, safe in your little bubble, throwing stones because it's easy. You're not a critic. You're a bully. The word hung in the air, sharp and damning. Kimmel's face went pale, his hands balling into fists. A bully? He spat, his voice shaking with rage. You come on my show, hijack my set, and call me a bully? You're the one throwing a tantrum because you can't take a joke. But his words lacked the earlier bite, and the audience wasn't buying it. They clapped louder, chanting De Niro's name, their support a tidal wave that left Kimmel stranded. The crew, sensing the chaos, hesitated, unsure whether to signal another break. De Niro raised a hand, silencing the crowd, his eyes locked on Kimmel. You're running out of chances, Jimmy. Apologize, or I walk out and let the world see you for what you are. The threat was real, and Kimmel knew it. The cameras were still rolling, the audience was against him, and De Niro's resolve was unbreakable. The studio felt like a pressure cooker, the tension so thick it seemed to pulse. With every heartbeat in the room, Robert De Niro stood firm, his gaze unrelenting, while Jimmy Kimmel, cornered on his own set, scrambled to regain control. The audience, now firmly in De Niro's corner, watched with bated breath, their earlier amusement replaced by a hunger for justice. Kimmel's eyes darted to the crowd, searching for any sign of loyalty, but the sea of faces stared back with disapproval. His charm, his quick wit, his carefully crafted persona, all of it was unraveling under De Niro's unyielding presence. Desperate to flip the script, Kimmel made a fatal mistake. He leaned forward, his voice sharp and reckless, and let his anger take the wheel. You know what, Robert? You're not some hero. You're just an old man clinging to a career that peaked decades ago. Nobody cares about your little movie, and nobody's buying this tough guy act, the audience gasped, the insult landing like a punch to the gut. De Niro's expression didn't change, but his silence was deafening, a calm before the storm that made Kimmel's outburst seem small and petty. The host, sensing he'd gone too far but too stubborn to back down, pressed on, his words tumbling out in a frantic bid to save face. You think you can walk in here and lecture me? I'm Jimmy Kimmel. This is my show, my rules. You don't get to demand apologies from me. You're not that important. The crowd booed, loud and unyielding, their voices a wall of rejection that shook Kimmel's confidence. He froze, realizing too late that he'd turned the room against him completely. De Niro took a slow, deliberate step forward, his presence filling the stage like a gathering storm. When he spoke, his voice was steady, each word carrying the weight of a lifetime in the spotlight. "You're right about one thing, Jimmy. This isn't about me being important. It's about standing up to people like you, who think they can tear others down to feel big. You called me old, outdated? Fine. But I've got something you'll never have. Integrity." The audience roared, their cheers shaking the studio walls. De Niro raised a hand, quieting them, his eyes never leaving Kimmel's. "I've spent my life telling stories that make people think, feel, remember. What do? You mock, you belittle, you hurt. And for what? A few cheap laughs? You're not a host, you're a coward." The word hit Kimmel like a slap, his face paling as the crowd erupted again, chanting De Niro's name. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked, drowned out by the audience's fervor. De Niro pressed forward, his voice rising with a passion that electrified the room. "You think you can insult me, my work, my choices, and walk away clean? You think you can hurt people and call it entertainment? Look at these people." He gestured to the audience, who leaned forward, hanging on his every word. "They're not here for your cruelty. They're here for something real. They're here because they believe in stories, in art, in heart. And you're just noise." The crowd leapt to their feet, their applause a thunderous wave of support, their voices united in a chant of "Robert B! Robert B!" Kimmel, his bravado shattered, sank back into his chair, his hands trembling. The cameras caught every second, his defeat written in the slump of his shoulders, the flicker of panic in his eyes. De Niro stood tall, his voice softening, but no less powerful. "You've got one last chance, Jimmy. Apologize. Not just to me, but to everyone you've ever mocked for a laugh. Show them you're more than this." The audience held its breath, the silence heavy with expectation. Kimmel's jaw tightened, his pride warring with the undeniable truth. He'd lost, and the world was watching. The studio was a crucible of emotion, every eye locked on the standoff between Robert De Niro and Jimmy Kimmel. The audience, now a unified force behind De Niro, stood on the edge of their seats, their earlier cheers fading into a charged silence. Kimmel, slumped in his chair, looked like a man who'd just realized he'd lost a fight he never should have started. His face was pale, his usual smirk gone, replaced by a mix of defiance and dread. The cameras, relentless in their focus, captured every twitch, every bead of sweat, as the weight of De Niro's words pressed down on him. The legend stood tall, his presence commanding, his eyes boring into Kimmel with an intensity that demanded resolution. The room waited, breathless, for what came next. Kimmel's hands gripped the desk, his knuckles white as he struggled to find his footing. He opened his mouth, then closed it, the silence stretching painfully. Finally, he spoke. His voice low and strained, each word dragged out like it cost him a piece of his pride. "All right, Robert, you win. I'm sorry." The word landed awkwardly, half-hearted, and the audience stirred, unimpressed. De Niro's brow furrowed, his head tilting slightly as if daring Kimmel to try again. "That's it?" De Niro said, his voice calm but cutting. "You think that's enough? You insulted me, my work, everything I stand for, and you toss out a word like it fixes everything? Try again, Jimmy. Mean it this time." The crowd murmured, their support for De Niro swelling like a tide. Kimmel's eyes darted to the audience, then back to De Niro, his jaw tightening as he realized there was no escape. He cleared his throat, his voice steadier but still laced with resentment. "Fine, I was out of line. I shouldn't have mocked your movie, your choices. It was a cheap shot, and I'm sorry." The apology was clearer, but it lacked warmth, and the audience sensed it. A few clapped, but most waited, their eyes on De Niro, who stood unmoved, his silence more powerful than any shout. He took a step closer, his voice low and deliberate. "It's not just about me, Jimmy. It's about everyone you've ever cut down to make yourself look clever. You owe them too." Kimmel's face flushed, his hands balling into fists, but the fight was gone from him. He nodded almost imperceptibly and turned to the audience. "I get it. Sometimes I go too far. I'm sorry for that." The words were clipped, but they carried a weight the crowd hadn't expected. A ripple of applause broke out, hesitant at first, then growing as the audience sensed the shift. De Niro nodded, just once, his expression softening but not relenting. "That's a start," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "But words aren't enough. You want to make this right? Start respecting the people who come on this stage, the work they do, the risks they take. That's what matters." The audience erupted, their cheers shaking the studio as they rose to their feet, clapping for De Niro's victory, for the truth he'd forced into the open. Kimmel sat back, defeated but composed, his eyes avoiding the cameras. De Niro turned to the crowd, raising a hand in acknowledgement, his face breaking into a rare, genuine smile. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice ringing clear. "It's about all of us who put our hearts into what we do, who take the hard road because it's worth it. Don't let anyone tell you it's not." The crowd roared louder, their applause a testament to the moment, to the man who'd stood up and won. De Niro stepped back, his point made, his dignity intact, leaving Kimmel to face the aftermath alone. The lights dimmed as the show cut to its final break, but the energy in the room lingered, a triumph of principle over pettiness.